back to the feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. Here, truth needs no consensus. I am Stephanie Weidel, and I'd like to encourage you all right now to like, comment, and subscribe to our channels. We are on all of your favorite podcast platforms, including YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Please visit our website at fedsforfreedom.org and sign up to become a member of our organization that seeks to bring truth, morals, and law back into our government, all from the inside. Today, Feds for Freedom's Vice President Jim Erdman and I are joined by Roger Severino, the Vice President of Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Today, we discuss the recent government employee pronoun policies released in all agencies and how they affect all federal employees, but also average American citizens. We discuss what federal employees can do to call out our government on their gross overreach by filing religious accommodations, First Amendment violation complaints, and Equal Employment Opportunity Commission complaints immediately. Welcome to the Feds, Roger. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
My pleasure.
All right, so could you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Heritage Foundation and what led you to start looking into the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services pronoun policy?
I am the Vice President for Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation. That covers the whole gamut of issues from energy to healthcare to religious liberty. Before that, I was at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, as the Director of the Office for Civil Rights. I dealt with a lot of questions with respect to transgender policies in healthcare, anti-discrimination law, etc. And before that, I was at the U.S. Department of Justice as a career attorney in the Civil Rights Division. So I'm very familiar with questions of freedom, of conscience, the gender identity conflicts, and I specifically worked at HHS as a top civil rights lawyer for 4 years.
Wow. So what put you into the realizing that the pronoun policy was starting? What brought you to that point?
Well, I knew that before this policy was unveiled, I had worked to roll back some Obama-era regulations under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, that was going to elevate transgender status, gender identity, and sexual orientation to a protected class status under our civil rights laws, even though Congress didn't actually include that in the Affordable Care Act. They prohibited sex discrimination, but the previous administration had reinterpreted that to include gender identity. Not sexual orientation, actually. They thought that was a bridge too far. The law wouldn't support it. So in the Trump administration, I actually rolled back those regulations consistent with the law. Sex, race, color, national origin, disability, age, those are actual protected classes in statute. Gender identity was not, because I knew where this was headed. If you start ignoring the law, you're just making stuff up. And some of the things that they are making up is the notion that in order to comply with civil rights law, you must use the pronoun of a person's choice, regardless of biological realities, which is a quite ironic position to come out of HHS, because that is the premier science and health agency in the entire federal government. In the NIH website today, we'll see how long it lasts, but at least as of today, you see web pages that say every cell in your body has a sex, either male or female. That's basic scientific biology. XXXY, the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. You could get into very detailed genetic analysis to figure out what is a male and female. It's incredibly important for the delivery of healthcare, for the advancement of science, that we know the difference between men and women. This was not controversial for the entirety of human history until about 5 seconds ago, when folks essentially on the left have been trying to redefine the term sex to include gender identity based not on science, but on subjective internal sense of self, preferences that may be fluid, that may change, that don't actually need a medical diagnosis, according to this new version. It's you are what you say you are based on your say-so. And the pernicious part about it all is that everybody else must go along, regardless of biological realities, regardless of religious belief, regardless of what they see in front of them. You have to go along and affirm it with your own lips. And that's the problem with this particular pronoun mandate.
May I ask, it sounds to me like HHS putting this policy together predicated it on, if I'm hearing you correctly, executive orders that helped pave the way, were there other measures they did to sort of pave or make it easier to sort of push these sort of things forward?
Yeah, and this is a long time coming. This notion really exploded on the scene. First, you had redefinition of marriage and the Obergefell decision. And people thought, well, maybe that'll stop there. But no, it went immediately to redefine what it means to be a man or a woman. It caught a lot of people by surprise. And there were the bathroom bills, so-called, that were coming out because folks wanted to include people of the opposite sex in intimate spaces, especially for women. And that created the first controversies, which caught a lot of people off guard. But once you have the Biden administration, it finally got the full backing of the administration. And it started with LGBT executive orders. Immediately when Biden took office, he issued executive orders saying that the federal agencies must review all their policies and any law that could possibly insert sexual orientation and gender identity in their policies. Then you had a very unfortunate Supreme Court case in the Bostock decision that reinterpreted sex for employment law purposes, Title VII, and this was Justice Gorsuch, which was quite the disappointment, to say that, in 1972, when they said sex, they meant to include transgender status somehow in hiring and firing decisions. Now, that was clearly wrong as a matter of law, but that's what we got from Justice Gorsuch. Then came another executive order saying, aha, now we're going to apply that everywhere. We're going to take it not just hiring and firing in Title VII, we're going to do it in education in Title IX, we're going to do it in healthcare in Section 1557. We're going to take that read and expand it everywhere. So you have the executive orders, followed by agency guidance. The first one that did this was OPM, saying all the federal agencies must adopt transgender and gender identity policies for employees. And they included forced pronoun usage and the use of intimate spaces based not on biology, but based on self-identification. Once the OPM guidance came out, you had the State Department come out with their own policies, and HHS in particular. I was able to break the story on Twitter, and that where I showed the world these are the policies that are being imposed at HHS, and that people need to stand up for their rights because they're now at risk of being fired if they know that a person is, say, male, and if they were to say he at the water cooler and somebody overhears and they report them to HR and says, aha, that is misgendering. It violates our now written policies. And those policies say if you repeatedly or intentionally, quote, misgender, which is actually correctly identifying a person by their sex. That's the Orwellian nature of this, but they call it misgendering. If you do such a thing, then that may be considered a hostile work environment. It may be considered threatening. It may be considered bullying, and it would be considered potentially illegal. Therefore, you'll be subject to disciplinary action. That is a clear threat that your job is at risk if you speak the truth about a person's biology. And here's perhaps the most pernicious part about the whole thing. Silence is apparently not an option. And how do pronouns actually get used? Well, when the subject of the conversation is not even in the room. So you have this a policy that's allegedly designed to protect a particular category of people when they're not even in the room. That's when you use a pronoun, right? It'd be rude for me to say, hey, Stephanie, I heard she was out to the baseball game yesterday when you're in the room with me. Nobody speaks that way, right? So when somebody's out of the room, somebody would say he or she. And if you were to say it, quote, incorrectly, then somebody will inform on you and go to HR and you'll be in trouble. And there's no defense to say, but I've known that this person is male all my life and they're only recently identifying as female. That doesn't matter. It's the say-so of the employee who identifies as whatever gender identity they want. And under the policy, that includes transgender, agender, gender fluid, intersex, asexual. I mean, the list goes on and on. There is no actual limit as to what pronoun a person could say they require you to use, and whether or not it has to have to do anything to match biological realities. And they expanded the policy to include intimate spaces. So HHS has a gym. I worked there for 4 years. I know they have a gym. And the gym has showers. And the policy itself says, recognizing that some employees may feel, quote, uncomfortable with that scenario. And let's presume it's going to be a woman, because that's the scenario that has happened across the country with these policies. A woman is in an intimate space, and all of a sudden, a biological male starts undressing in front of her. Under these policies, she has to leave. Doesn't matter if she's a victim of sexual assault, and this is triggering and traumatizing. Doesn't matter what she thinks about what's going on in front of her. She's the one who has to leave if she's uncomfortable. That's what this policy says.
You explained this really well, Roger. Thank you. Our audience is comprised not just of federal employees, but also average American citizens who are awake to what's going on within our federal government. But many people, although they see this and they're starting to see their agency put out pronoun policies, many American citizens do not know what is going on within our government. So this is why we are discussing this right now, because if the government is doing this, it's coming to your town. I was shocked when I read the HHS policy. They began in their policy, this was put out, I'm pretty sure, October 11th, 2023, so just very recently. This is at the very beginning, page 2. For some individuals, sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, for some, that is not static and can change. When I read that statement is not true and is inherently against my religious beliefs. So just taking that, what can people do to combat this?
Yes, and there's two things. There is the biological reality. A person cannot actually change their sex. That is basic fundamental biology. And what they're trying to tell you is that 2 + 2 does not equal 4, it equals 5. And they want you to say it with your own mouth. And that's the authoritarianism behind this sort of thing. They want you to confess something that is false with your own lips. And if you give the government, whether you're a federal employee or outside of the federal employee, when you give the government that sort of absolute power, they have power to do everything, right? To shape how you think. If they could force you to speak with your own words, a lie. And that's the step number 1. This is compelled speech, which is contrary to the Constitution. It's adopting a government approved ideology as your own. And I'll get to the religious liberty components in the second part, but sticking with compelled speech, we faced this issue back during World War II, West Virginia versus Barnett, a very famous Supreme Court case where we had schools mandating school students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, to actually pledge allegiance to the flag. And there are some folks that, according to their religious beliefs, would not actually take oaths. And that goes back to the beginning of the United States. We actually have accommodation for people who don't want to take oaths. So this was in the middle of World War II. They had very good reasons to require kids to take the pledge. But we also have the Constitution. And in the Barnett case, it said that there is no government mandated orthodoxy that you can impose even on school children, even during wartime. Our Constitution is made for people to be able to think on their own and not be forced to recite something that violates their own conscience and religious beliefs. And that's over a Pledge of Allegiance. Here, to the American flag, here it's more like a Pledge of Allegiance to the rainbow flag is what they're pushing on American society. Whether you agree with it or not, you must comply with it and pledge that sort of allegiance, despite being contrary to biological realities that are sometimes quite obvious. On the religious freedom component, yes, it violates the religious freedom of many untold thousands, if not millions of people who believe we are created male and female as complements to each other. And in that creation, that will even in heaven be male and female. And it reminds me, when I was in Harvard Law School, I took a class with Alan Dershowitz. And he asked all the class, how would you feel if you get to heaven and you are no longer white or African American or Asian, you're just everybody blue? Would you feel you were missing something? And how many people raise your hand? Very few people raise their hand. And then he asked the question, well, what if you get to heaven, you realize you're no longer male and female? How many people would be troubled by that? All sorts of hands go up. And it's true because our identity as male and female is integral to humanity. And this was known since time immemorial and is clearly also supported by the major religions of the world. So Not only is it compelled speech under the First Amendment, it's also a violation of religious freedom under the First Amendment as well. They're two different clauses. And this shows the entire government overreach. Nowhere in the guidance or the executive orders from Biden do you see any mention of religious freedom or religious accommodation, which, by the way, under Title VII is required. They must accommodate religious believers in the workplace. And if they don't, they have to have a pretty substantial justification for doing so. So I recommend listeners, if you're in the federal government, file religious accommodation complaints if this violates your faith. You have to exercise your right, use it or lose it. File also complaints under the First Amendment. Be ready to sue. There are public interest law firms that could do it for free. And reach out to the Heritage Foundation. We could connect you with folks that will help guide you and how you could properly draft a religious accommodation request or a First Amendment request. This is important. It's use it or lose it. The way this gets adopted is if nobody speaks up. If nobody speaks up, they will continue to roll. And if only one or two people speak up, they say, you guys are just a fringe minority, when people who disagree are not. They absolutely are not. But there's this climate of fear and intimidation. People don't want to stick up and say, hey, maybe they won't come to me. There's not a trans identifying person in my office at the moment or in my particular unit. But remember what I said earlier. This is about what you say at the water cooler. It doesn't matter if you have somebody who identifies as LGBT in your work unit. What matters is they're going to smoke you out to find out what you believe by forcing you to say something that's contrary to the truth or contrary to the truth supported by your religious beliefs. I don't see a way out. The forced pronoun usage, introduce yourself, identify your pronouns as you introduce yourself, put it on your emails. Don't think that you're going to get away from this all-encompassing totalitarian impulse. The point is that they want to smoke people out. That is the point. They will not be brooking any dissent. And we saw this much with the vax mandate, where even though the information was clear, especially with things like children, and it wasn't about efficacy of the vaccine, it was about making a point and requiring compliance. And once people are able to be forced to do those things, that are either against their will or against science or against the truth of the matter, then you give all the power to the government. They can do anything.
So, and going back to a couple points you just made, it sounds to me, if something is predicated on executive orders, it's not legislative action, and we have the experience of COVID, I mean, in the end, I think employees can say to their employer, we've played this game before, and it resulted in widespread litigation, huge losses, and I don't think, my advice to employees would be, this will end up in litigation. Is this really where our agency and department wants to be 2 years from now? That's the first thing. The other thing that struck me when you talked about the bathroom example, that's the opposite of how harassment claims are handled. If there is harassment going on in the office, let's say I'm harassing Stephanie. I don't mean to. I try to be kind, but it happens sometimes. Stephanie, I'm sure, is irritated with me sometimes on these interviews. But let's say she brings up a harassment claim. It's not Stephanie that has to leave when that happens. If I'm being whatever it is, whether I'm throwing staplers in the office or doing whatever, it's I who have to move from the position till the investigation is completed. So that seems a bit backwards to me, and I feel like, I don't know what you think, but identifying it as such, as being contrary to all previous handling of harassment, seems like another, what do you think? Is that another method we could use to sort of chip away at these things?
You make an excellent point. It used to be the case that if an employer allowed a male to undress in front of a female employee, that is an instant violation of Title VII, harassment, and anti-discrimination law. It's open and shut case. It doesn't get any clearer. There's no possible excuse you could come up with as to why you would tolerate a male employee undressing as if they have a right to in front of a female colleague. But they've inverted it. So now, if that male employee merely says, but I identify as female, or I identify as non-binder, or I identify as genderqueer, or I identify as gender fluid. It's any of those, right? It's any of those. No need for a doctor's note, no need for any psychological assessment, no need for a change of license, no need for surgery, no need for hormone treatment, none of it. It's I identify as such, therefore you have to leave if you are uncomfortable.
That makes perfect sense to me. Yeah, I mean, that's a dramatic change, but it also, I'm talking about just in general terms. If I'm just a hostile boss and someone makes a complaint against me, they are not allowed by our own regulations to move that officer away and say, well, you made the complaint, so I guess you better go somewhere else. No. And so that's sort of my point. I think that makes sense. That's something we could use in our tool to chip away at it. And again, not to be...
Rights.
Yeah, thank you.
So
thank you.
Civil rights law had granted pretty much the strongest protections against retaliation. If you take a protected action, file a complaint, which is why I think people really need to file at the very least religious accommodation complaints and requests, because then you get the extra protection against retaliation. You should not be able to be transferred, retaliated against, get a knocked on your performance review because you announced that, hey, this is something I'm taking a protected action on. I'm filing an accommodation request. At that moment, they got to be hands off. But the point you bring up is a very savvy one. That has flipped, where if you complain as a female saying, there was a man undressing in front of me in the HHS gym in the showers, who just came out of the shower, and I feel this is a hostile environment. All of a sudden, you've outed yourself as a potential bigot to the HR department. That's how they will see you, right? And because what they say in how they announce this policy is that it is a matter of safety. Again, this is quite Orwellian, that if a woman feels unsafe and raises her voice to her bosses, she is labeled as the threatening one, the intolerant one, the one that's making people feel unsafe, which flips everything on its head.
It's insane.
But here we are. That is actually what the logic of their position is.
I'm going to pose to you a question that my husband asked me at the very beginning of the COVID mandates. Don't they have lawyers who know the law? Don't they have lawyers in the government that know this?
They do. And
so what is their goal?
That's what makes this so offensive. They know it and they're doing it anyway.
Why?
They know it and they're doing it anyway. They are taking a Supreme Court case and trying to expand it way beyond its bounds because they're trying to make a point. It is a matter of ideology. There has not been a rash of complaints of some sort of gender identity crisis at HHS where employees have been beat up. And now we have to have this massive change in policy because we have this extraordinary problem that we need emergency action to take care of it. It's not at all. It's ideologically driven. And the ideology is based on mass compliance, where everybody has to bow down and agree. It is premised on that. And that's what comes out of this. It is premised on everybody's required to participate. And it's kind of like the old story, Les Wallach, I think he said it, when in Poland, under the Soviet era, everybody had to put the Workers of the World Unite slogan and sticker on their shops, on their shop windows. And if they didn't, they would get in trouble with the authorities. That's the point. Everybody is required to pledge their allegiance or be smoked out, because that is what this totalizing, right? It's all-encompassing ideology requires. This is part and parcel of what they want to impose because they want to impose it. And that's the thing. It's not because there's some actual safety crisis that they're addressing, given the very small number of trans-identifying employees in most workplaces. No, this is a matter of making everybody go along with a new state-sanctioned ideology.
I want two comments on that, maybe comments and questions. The lawyer piece at the agency that I worked at, the lawyers are there to get to yes. And that I always loved that about working at the CIA. The lawyers wanted to make sure nobody got in trouble, but they were always trying to work their way directly up to the very edge of the line that would allow something to happen. The problem is if you have fearful leaders or politically motivated leadership that really wants to, I've got lots of terms for it, I'm going to find a nice one, impress their bosses, we'll say, manage up. They'll find ways to make things as close to what they want as possible, and they'll use those lawyers in that capacity. And the lawyers, it's not like you get malpractice suits when you're working for the government. Nobody's going to sue them because they've misinterpreted, the Supreme Court. That's my commentary. Maybe this is commentary too, but you mentioned about the water cooler and people having a conversation, and you're over there saying he, she, and apparently it's wrong, whatever it is. The other thing I've learned over the last couple of years is there's very, very few people willing to stick their neck out and take a risk for that. I do, however, believe there's lots and lots of fearful people. And I think if fear works on the other side, maybe it can work on ours. And maybe this isn't the best way to encourage it, but making people fearful that even their private conversations are subject to these things will motivate them more than saying, why don't you go be a hero? That's, I think, unfortunately, not to be Hobbesian in my view of human nature, I tend to think fear will work better for employees who really just want to mind their own business. And if they fear that anything they say anywhere, it might. I don't know. What do you think, Roger? You've been dealing with this longer than us, so.
It's true. I mean, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for employees in workplaces across the country that fear the pronoun police, because they are there and they just want to do their job, earn a living, go back to their families. And the question is that a viable strategy? Right. It's a question of, are they going to come after you now or later? It's really a question of when. Because this ideology isn't about live and let live. It is designed to smoke people out. That's what this policy is for, right? Again, it's not responding to a crisis of workplace violence on gender identity questions or mass discrimination going on. Again, this is an issue where they want to require people who disagree with the facts of the matter to change their views by speaking something false with their own lips, to say that men can become women and vice versa. That's what's being required of people, to say, well, this person, Bob, that you've known for 20 years is now Pamela. You must acknowledge that Bob is a woman and perhaps always was a woman. You must affirm that. If not, you're a bigot and we're going to get rid of you.
So do you think... Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Pronouns are part of human language. There are very good reasons it exists. It makes life very simple. Because it's so endemic to human language, they're going to smoke you out. And that's why they've picked this as the means of doing it, because it is practically unavoidable. The amount of mental energy you would have to exert to avoid pronoun usage, to try to get away from it, is quite taxing, and very few could even accomplish it.
Do you think they will go through and fire people over this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There will be people who say, I'm sorry, I refuse to say the person I've known for 10 years is, that's male, is she. Right? And I can't say that falsehood. And they will say, okay, you must. And if they don't, they will get fired. Now, if they do a religious accommodation request, maybe they will come to their senses and realized that, you know what, maybe we don't have a compelling enough interest in doing this.
We
But
have
go ahead.
Sorry, we have a lot of people in our organization, over 9,000 members and beyond that, who put in for religious exemptions, accommodations for the COVID mandates. And we know how it went down. It went into this vault and wasn't touched forever. And it was just then thrown out. And multiple people went through the EEO claims. And then they got to a judge and it was thrown out. So
I do think, Stephanie, we're going to be better at it. But go ahead, Roger.
Well, there were some significant victories on religious accommodation claims. It took a while, though, with respect to the vaccine. We won on the OSHA mandate through the Supreme Court, so we got rid of that because that was the Biden administration overreaching. Fifth Circuit had very good language on religious accommodation, and it depends on what area. So there were some losses in the healthcare space on religious accommodation, but outside of it, there were some victories. But you have to exercise your right and be willing to go through the discomfort of being labeled as, okay, you're one of those who are not going to comply, but they're going to label you that anyway, right? And your choices
already on lists. We know we're already on that list.
And at least you get, when you file a complaint, you get the protection against retaliation in law. You're actually in a better legal position, by and large, the second you file an accommodation request than before. Because they will try to get rid of you, because I've done employment law, I still do some, by retaliation, make your life miserable the minute they've spotted you as not a team player, whether it's on a vaccine or pronouns. Once they label you, they will try to get you out and drive you out. If you have filed an EEOC complaint, much harder for them to do so. Then they have to justify everything on its own. Otherwise, it is retaliation. So I highly recommend people start filing their religious accommodation requests yesterday for any workplace that has a pronoun policy and a bathroom policy based on gender identity.
That's great. You know, I got another question and also another comment, and maybe you can help me with both. You know, do you think it's purposeful that they push these sort of policies specifically, seemingly first, through, well, I think DOD's on that list too, but public health? I personally don't think it's a mistake that they push it through HHS or those organizations first, because once it becomes a matter of science, then it becomes a matter, this is my personal opinion, I don't know, Roger, you're the expert here, but do you think that's purposeful? The whole pushing it through the science side first so that it makes it harder down the line?
Oh, yes.
The question I have to start with is, do you think it's purposeful that the administration, particularly this one, but administrations and management push this through the health sector first as a means to sort of make it settled science? I mean, you know, so do you think that's part of the strategy behind it, or do you think it's not quite that Machiavellian and it's just whoever can do it, get to the finish line first, they'll take it?
No, I think it is quite intentional. HHS is the premier scientific and health organization in the entire federal government. They've been captured by this gender ideology for some time now, and it's most visible in Admiral Rachel Levine, who was formerly Richard Levine, for years identified as a man, and now identifies as female, and is now the highest ranking trans-identifying person in the entire federal government, the Assistant Secretary of Health, which is effectively the number 3 officer in all of HHS. And I had met with Levine when I was head of the Office for Civil Rights and invited a lot of trans activists and medical professionals that were doing all of these experimental treatments, especially on children, and then asked a very simple question. What does it mean to be female? So I asked the what is a woman question before Matt Walsh did. And because I was formulating the policies on how we're going to deal with gender identity and rolling back the Obama era regs. And Levine and company had no answer. It was just stream of consciousness, almost unintelligible, and not based on actual science. but on pure emotivism, on how people could subjectively identify. Because we asked, okay, first, are you doing any of these transitions on children? And Levine denied it at first. And so we said, well, by children, let's be clear. We're talking minors. And finally, we got that clear that yes, Levine supports the surgeries and cross-sex hormones on minors that to block puberty and beyond. We asked another simple question. Okay, so if you say this is something that's biologically based, that one is born in the wrong body, but they have a male or female brain, then surely you must do some tests, some scans to make sure that, okay, we have the evidence that this person is in their, quote, wrong body. And the answer was, no, we don't do that. We just go ahead with the surgeries, the puberty blockers, etc. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that this is something that is biologically based, but we're never going to test for it to find out if somebody's actually transgender or not. And it goes back to Stephanie's earlier point, where they're saying everything's fluid now. Well, sometimes they say gender identity and sexual orientation is fluid. Sometimes they say it's how you're born. You're born that way. But it's got to be one or the other, right? You would think. You can't say that it's exclusively, but they always want to have it both ways. And whatever allows them to require the coverage for the surgeries and the cross-sex hormones in insurance, again, a mandate to force people to do this. This was a proposed regulation under the Obama and now Biden administrations. And then forced pronoun usage in the federal workplace and coming to a workplace near you. So EEOC has already issued very similar guidance saying that they will enforce Title VII in all workplaces that are covered by civil rights law. That's pretty much all workplaces with about 15 employees. And they will say you must have your own pronoun policies. So if you think, well, it's not going to come to me, yeah, it's just a matter of time.
Okay, I hate to admit it, sometimes I'm a petty little man. I work in an organization or worked in an organization that we taught languages because people needed to be able to speak foreign languages. And, for example, I speak Mandarin and Arabic. Now, Mandarin, there are no pronouns. There's no, there are, but you'd have to read the character to know if it was he or she. It's just ta, he or she. Whereas Arabic and pretty much every Romance language has very strict rules on genders. If I were the one in charge, you can tell me if I'd get in trouble for this. If I were the one in charge of assigning people languages so that they could go out to certain posts, I'd send them to all the Chinese, because that means they spend the rest of their career in Africa, China, and Taiwan. And everyone else can get French, Italian, German. I'm sort of being facetious here, but you can't run a business like, let's just say, Statecraft, Department of State, or CIA. If you're teaching, you're like, oh, I'm sorry, will you be offended if you take 2 years of Arabic but don't know any of the pronouns which are required? It just seems absolutely absurd, and it feels like another, as far as I'm concerned, an attack vector. If somebody came to me and said, well, I can't, your pronouns, they're like, well, then you need to not learn a language, go somewhere else. You don't get posted to France or Italy because they believe in pronouns. It sounds silly, but it affects everything.
And the international side is very important. State Department has their own forced pronoun policy where you'll get fired if you, quote, misgender somebody. That applies to the consulate and embassy in, say, Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, where they take the embodiment of men and women quite seriously as a political matter, as a policy matter, as a social science matter, as a religious matter. They absolutely believe in the embodiment of male and female. So now the State Department is imposing this pronoun policy, the very left-wing American invention culture, to a Muslim country and every Muslim country. So if you work as a contractor, which may be even, working as a caterer in the embassy in Jakarta, you have to follow this new pronoun policy, regardless of your religious belief, regardless of your culture, regardless of your tradition and history, regardless of your beliefs with respect to science, which, by the way, are universal about what is a man and a woman, that all goes out the window in the name of this ideology. And one interesting point about the HHS policy itself, it applies to employees. It applies to contractors. It also applies to visitors. If anybody visits an HHS building, or you're part of Indian Health Service and you want to get a treatment there, you have any business to do with HHS, you have to comply with this pronoun policy. That is just so much overreach. Now we have to have visitors willing to challenge those policies to say, I'm sorry, I just want to receive a government service that I'm entitled to. Don't force me to violate my beliefs, religious or scientific, in order to get a government benefit. That is a form of hostage taking that apparently they're willing to do to force people to comply, even visitors.
So do you think then that, I mean, I hate to say it, again, it feels like a repeat, but is this going to end up in litigation? Is this how this gets resolved again? Somebody decides I'm just not going to do it, and they don't do it, and that's where it's going to end up? Because, maybe it's just better to get there sooner rather than later, if that's the case.
It is absolutely better to get there sooner. Far better to do what's known as a pre-enforcement challenge. You say, this violates my rights against compelled speech. I will not comply. And you sue. And then HHS and the federal agencies and even EEOC with their guidance, will say, well, let's wait until we apply it. And then judges, especially in places like the Fifth Circuit in Texas, which are very good on the law, will say, hold on a second, we're not going to let you get away with this. We know what you wrote. We know what you said. You either mean it or you don't. You either mean it that you say, quote, misgendering creates a hostile work environment, or it doesn't, right? And you can't have it both ways to say, well, maybe we'll enforce it, maybe we won't, because guess what? The minute you get the water cooler talk and somebody reports that, hey, somebody used the wrong pronoun, quote, wrong pronoun, that goes to HR. What are they going to point to? They're going to point to the policy and say, you knew it and you violated it. So I think it's better to be on the front end than trying to defend yourself after the fact when things might get tough if they start saying, hey, we're going to fire you. And then you got to scramble to go find a lawyer. But you can always file the EEOC complaint and always file the EEOC accommodation request to get that additional protection.
So
what makes me so sad
go ahead, Steph.
listening to this is that our organization is made up of the people who stood up, who did spend their money, who did became plaintiffs for these cases that have won in our favor. And yet it's going to be those same people who are going to sue again over this. Can we ever catch a break? Can we ever stop this before spending all of this time and this energy?
And Steph, that's
really trying to bleed us.
Steph, that's a good segue to the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask Roger, what does a coalition of groups say? I was going to say the same thing about our group, but what sort of coalition would be the ideal coalition to bring this to court? Do we need state AGs to sort of weigh in on this, like they did with Missouri v. Biden? Is it an organization like Feds for Freedom? Or who else could be part of a coalition that could bring something like this to court before it becomes more dumb?
Well, an organization like yours, if you represent the interests of your members who object, you could get potentially organizational standing, right? It could be Feds for Freedom versus HHS or versus Becerra's.
That's like our BGA lawsuit for the vaccine mandate. That's the Supreme Court, yeah.
How it would be captioned. So yes, if you get organizational standing, that'd be a great way of doing it. And that gives protection for your members, many of which don't have to be outed by name. At the very least, in the very beginning of a litigation, they wouldn't very likely not have to be outed. That's one very important vehicle for exercising your rights, and especially for your members. So it's something you should very seriously consider pursuing, because when people band together, there is safety in numbers. Right? Nobody wants to be the first one to stick their head out. I understand that. I have tremendous sympathy for people, but your listeners are the courageous ones, right? You all stood up during a vax mandate, during the government overreach. And Stephanie, you asked, okay, how could we prevent this without litigation. Well, it comes from who's in power, right? Right now, we have a very authoritarian anti-science administration with President Biden. We rolled back many of the mandates on the gender identity side that came from President Obama under President Trump. I was 4 years fighting for people's individual liberties and for science. God willing, the things will change with the next election, and we'll be able to have people in power that will restore the sense of normalcy when it comes to these questions, where we have compassion, absolutely, for people who are struggling with questions of sexual identity, but you don't force people to deny realities. You don't force people to violate their religious beliefs. You have a tolerant workplace of people of all these views, but that's the opposite of what we have now, where women of goodwill, in particular, are being labeled as threats to biological males in what should have been considered women's safe spaces.
Roger, thank you so much for everything that you have said tonight. You have laid out a path ahead for us to combat these pronoun policies. And you might have already answered this next question that I'm going to ask you, but I like to end with this one. What can the average American citizen do to combat the corruption? And in this case, these pronoun policies, these are average American citizens. What can they do?
These policies don't come from nowhere. They're imposed through regulations and guidance. This is not how the founders envisioned that our country would be run, but here we are. Instead of Congress passing laws, it is federal agencies that are passing regulations. The people have a role in pushing back against regulations. You could file what are known as public comments. When there's a regulation that comes down that will impact you, I encourage everyone to file comments with federal agencies laying out your objections. They matter. I was made aware of this when I was a federal regulator, and opponents, which was from the liberal left, filed hundreds of thousands of comments to try to slow down and derail the regulations and set up lawsuits. Folks who believe in liberty and the rule of law should use the tools available to them. And when this administration, currently the Biden one, is overreaching, file public comments, letting your voice be heard. Because the worst thing that could happen is for a federal agency to say, we proposed these mandates on the American public, and nobody said a peep, or just a handful of people that we could dismiss as somehow being fringe. No, people need to stand up, file comments, let their voice be heard. Now, the Heritage Foundation, we have a whole project on filing comments. Heritage Action has portals on major regulations where it's very easy for you to come in and type up your objections to any federal comment, federal regulation of all types on energy policy, environmental policy, labor, health, gender identity, life and abortion, all of these issues. We have portals for filing comments, so get involved. Heritage Foundation is one. Ethics and Public Policy Center has an HHS project as well, an accountability project. And we get together and file comments. If they do not respond, the agencies, to the comments, that is grounds for a lawsuit. If they do not adequately respond and just wave a hand and say, well, thank you for presenting this study showing why we're wrong, we're not going to respond, that could be grounds for a lawsuit. And we have won, right, in these sorts of cases because the agencies have not followed the rules in properly responding to public comments. So regulations.gov is where the comments are, but it's much easier if you go through the Heritage portal and other organizational portals. That's one very tangible way to get involved, file comments. And then if the agencies ignore your comments, maybe we could get a lawsuit. And if they still go through with the comments, you could file your lawsuit once the rules are put into effect, if they personally affect you.
That's great information. That's great information. The comment information is particularly interesting. Does that include internal regulations? Like, let's say there's an internal regulation for an organization, like the CIA, where you're not going to see a whole lot of public discussion, or like some of the DoD stuff. Does that include that as well?
It generally does not. So it's usually public notices of proposed rulemaking, NPRMs, where the public has the opportunity to comment, and they're public facing, but they have the force and effect of law. So if they bind members of the public, then they're required to do the NPRM process. But this administration is now doing guidance because they know that they're going to be vulnerable if they do the process and expose themselves to public comments and criticism. They're now doing it by guidance. They're afraid, and rightly so, because people have learned the game and say, "No, we're not going to let you get away with it that way." And now, I mean, I'll give you one example. Under the Obama administration, they added a new sexual orientation, non-discrimination policy to all federal grant-making authorities based on 7 comments received by the public. They received 7 comments and said, because of that, we're going to add this new protected class. And by the way, it's non-controversial because we didn't receive any comments in opposition. That was then. I think we've woken up to how they were playing the game. And that was an abuse to take more power. And now we got to know that the federal agencies are the main sources of taking away people's liberties now. The OSHA mandate was from a federal agency, right? All the CDC guidance that was thereafter imposed as mandates by the state came from the federal government. I fought very hard against CDC when they were imposing all these COVID restrictions on houses of worship. And the only guidance we took down, the CDC did, was the one on reopening houses of worship. Because I and a very few number of others stood up and said, you know what, there's no authority for this. There's religious freedom. You're taking away people's liberties. We need more people to stand up and let their voices be heard.
Well, I'm going to have just one comment, and then we can close it up. But with Stephanie closing it up here. But my one comment is, Feds for Freedom listeners, you heard Roger here. If this is something you would like to pursue, you have to let us know. So you need to listen to the podcast, hit like, subscribe, go check out Heritage Foundation, but let us know. If you want us to begin exploring what is possible in a pre-enforcement challenge, you have to let us know. And now I'll just let Stephanie and Roger close things out.
And follow me on Twitter at Roger Severino _, and you'll be able to be informed on when we're filing comments.
Yes, thank you for that. I have really enjoyed reading some of your Twitter posts, and that's how I found you, is what you said about the HHS policy. Thank you so much, Roger, for coming on. We really enjoyed having you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Please note that if you're interested in filing a First Amendment complaint regarding your agency's pronoun policy, please contact Jim Erdman at jim@fedsforfreedom.org.